Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of Project Slave 1. Now that all the 3D printing's out of the way, I can finally get on with painting this monster model. But first I want to detail up the inside of the lower hull. I felt there was too much blank canvas, and that in reality this part of Slave 1 would have had much more going on. So I started adding detail panels from sheet styrene, trying to follow the contours of the inside of the hull and also radiating out. This would emphasise the bowl shape of the lower hull and contrast well with the grid-like engine details. There were some details copied from the studio model, but mostly I just made it up as I went along. Part of the problem here is because the original gambody hull profile is too wide at the boarding ramp end. This solution should work fine for this model, but it'll be corrected when I release my own files. Now let's look at painting Slave 1. My primary reference is going to be sculpting a galaxy, which has an excellent studio photo of the underside, and this is what I'm going to try and match. The original model was painted fully assembled, and in several photos you can see overspray across the parts. I have the luxury of time, and I'm able to break down Slave 1 into easy-to-paint units. I may go a little off-piste in areas where I feel tweaking would improve credibility, but this is my starting point. Of course, the first thing to do is prime the model. Slave 1 appears to be base-coated in grey. ArchiveX produced a grey which is a good match, but I was going to need an industrial amount. Vallejo do some good primers ready to spray with an airbrush, straight from the bottle, but I figured that would take forever. So I decided to go for the nuclear option and used rattle cans. Part of the problem with painting Slave 1 was breaking it down into manageable units of the same colour palette. The wing parts are now cleaned up, prepped and ready for primer. These are supposed to be an off-white, so they'll get a coat of white primer to start with. The main engine parts will get a coat of matte black, with the lighter parts getting either grey or white primer. The colour choice of the primer can affect the saturation of the final paint colour, so it's certainly worth considering. Pale paint colours such as white and yellow generally don't cover dark primers well, so it pays to plan ahead. For most of the parts, grey primer is perfectly adequate, but for some parts where you want a lot of shadow to create depth, like the antenna shroud, a black primer works best. The car primer works well not only on the 3D prints, but also on the metal parts for the guns too. It took me quite a while to wrap my head around what colours to use where, and then what primer to paint everything, as there were no clear guidelines. I hope this video will give a pretty good guide to anyone else wanting to paint Slave 1 in the future. The main hull was certainly going to get grey primer, as I could be pretty sure this is what the studio had used back in the day. It was stripped of all its external parts, and the spare canopy was left in place to mask and protect the cockpit. Okay, let's shoot some primer. I'm starting with the underside and just covering everything in sight. Just building it up in light strokes works well, and hopefully will prevent any runs. Just taking it slow and steady. One of the functions of the primer, as well as providing a good base key for the colour layer, is to show any flaws in the surface that need attention. There are quite a few showing up here. Where excess glue needs removing or the surface needs more filling, it's all part of the process. With part of the stand now inserted, I can handle the hull better to start spraying the other areas. The shoulder bells and underside of the tail are the next to get the grey primer. The wing mounts in the shoulders will ultimately get a coat of matte black to create depth and shadow, but the grey will get the ball rolling. With the stand now mounted in a vise, I can start to spray the upper surface of Slave 1. It's pretty easy, but the primer is showing up a lot of areas where it's going to need some TLC. The styrene areas all look fine, but the original ABS 3D prints will need some attention. That'll have to wait until the next episode, when I tackle the upper hull and finally finish this build. But don't worry, I do have lots of other projects lined up. If you've enjoyed this build, you're going to love what's coming next, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon so you catch every video when it goes live. And here's all the parts now fully primed in their various colours. Where I wasn't sure which colour to go for, I settled for my default white. Any dust, scratches and defects have now been sorted and they're all ready for paint. The main hull is now dry and finally in one colour. I'm really happy with all the styrene work I've put into this model. It all looks clean and crisp. The ABS prints are a different story, mainly because of scribing lines through varying materials, where there are joins or areas of filler. It's going to take some work to sort out, but I'm up for it. I'm sure it'll be fine in the end. Now, on to paint. To paint Slave 1, I'm going to be using Archive X acrylics. These have been carefully colour matched to be the most accurate paints for painting models from the Star Wars universe. Fortunately, they produce a set specifically for Slave 1. These acrylics come in handy eyedropper bottles and have excellent opacity, even the white, yellow and red, which are often problem colours to get good coverage with. As a starting point, I set up colour swatches for all the paints, so I could better decide what to use where. Star Wars models have paints in layers, and Slave 1 is probably the best example of that. The history of Slave 1 shows it went through a few repaints, and closer inspection of the studio model reveals a very complex paint scheme. Fortunately, John Simmons, who works closely with Archive X, has helped me decipher the painting process. John makes lots of incredible Star Wars models, so if you like my Slave 1, check out his channel and subscribe. There's a link in the description. Okay, now for some colour. I'm going to start with the wings. I'm using a method known as pre-shading, where a dark colour is applied to the shadow areas to create variation and depth to the colour layer of the model. For this I'm using Vallejo red-brown. I wanted to use a warm colour to preserve the warmth of the white final coat. This sprayed really easily, as you'd expect from Vallejo, and provided me with a base layer for my next colour. There were a lot of shadow areas and I had to be careful not to miss any. Next I sprayed a coat of Vallejo dark yellow to the flat areas. This helped blend in the previous red-brown. Painting the wings I knew what I wanted to achieve, it was just a matter of finding the right approach to get there. I then sprayed Archive X Armour Yellow to the areas indicated by the studio model. These were then going to be masked off, ready for the final colour layer. Slave 1 has some pretty crazy patterns over its surface due to the multiple colour layers, and this effect is achieved with masking fluid. This latex paint is applied to the surface of the model. It dries pretty quickly, and once the top coat of paint is dry, it's easily rubbed off. I'm going to use it to mask some of the yellow patches on the wings, trying to match the studio photos as closely as possible. I'm just using a cheap brush as the fluid won't wash out and the brush will have to get binned. It's easy to apply, but trying to get it to look like a naturally bare area takes a bit of thought and care. This is my first attempt at using this fluid, so it'll be intriguing to see how it comes out. With everything masked off, it's time to spray the white top coat. The plan is for the tones underneath to tint the top colour. It's looking pretty good, but I'm finding the white too stark. It reminds me of winter camo on a World War II tank. Not quite what I'm after. Now for the fun bit, removing the masking tape. It's a bit fiddly around the trailing edge, but it's done its job. I've got good clean sharp edges just where I want them. Let's see how well the masking fluid comes off. Really easily, and leaves a great effect. A good random edge, just what I was after. It's easy to remove from flat surfaces, but I would think very difficult where there's a lot of detail. To try and warm up the stark white, I gave everything a light coat of a mix of armour yellow and white. This gave me back the level of warmth I was after. Next I hand painted the ribbed panel at the root of the wing arm in SP Lark light grey, and I also painted a detail to the underside of the wing ends in light reefer grey. There's a red panel on the underside of one wing, which I masked and sprayed in boxcar red. Then I gave everything a coat of matte varnish, ready for the next stage. Oil paints are a modeller's friend and can add a lot of effects to a model, enhancing its character. On Slave 1 I'm just going to be using two colours, French ultramarine and burnt umber. These artist's oils can be used in a variety of ways to add shadow and weathering effects to any model. These two colours are the ones I used most and will probably last me a lifetime. They're well worth the investment for any modeller. Small amounts of each are applied to an artist's palette, mixed and thinned with white spirit. The washes are selectively applied to areas to enhance shadows and create weathering. When creating the weathering effects, it's a good idea to think beforehand just how the subject would naturally weather. Some areas weather more than others, some have direction, others may have splatters and streaking from leaking fluids. Just use your imagination and take your time. The oils are slow drying and can be reactivated if you want to make changes. And here's the finished wing, ready to go on Slave 1. The weathering's finished, and I've decided to go slightly paler on the front blade to create variation. Where there are moving parts, I've decided to add a lot of staining and streaking to simulate leaking fluids from worn parts. I'll only be gluing the parts together at final assembly when everything's been painted. The engine exhausts were all based in white primer and masked using various methods, ready for a coat of armour yellow. This sprayed really well and had great opacity. These parts were made from aluminium on the real model, and I had to bear that in mind when trying to work out the painting process. Once fully dried, they were masked using the liquid latex solution, again matching the studio model. They were then sprayed with a coat of Archive X Rust. I tried to vary the opacity to give a degree of variation to the colour. Then it was time to rub off the masking fluid. I do enjoy this bit, it's an instant dramatic change. I'm getting the hang of this stuff. You can get some really good patterns with care and patience. I decided the exhausts were a bit too bold, so after dry brushing some acrylic bronze to knock them back a bit, I sprayed engine black around their bases to blend them into the shadows. The interior parts were sprayed aluminium with a rattle can, and then given a light oil wash of French ultramarine. Details were picked out with metallic acrylics, and then things were toned down further with the standard oil treatment. The engine fairings were sprayed with Archive X concrete over grey primer on the outer surface as a base layer. Some areas were then liquid masked, and the inside was sprayed with grimy black to deepen the shadows when everything was assembled. The outside was then given a light spray of GN grey-green to give a patchy effect. On the real model, these parts are a sort of worn greyish green, and that's what I was aiming for. I tried to blend the grey-green down to the black to make a good transition. Most of this is hidden, so it's not crucial to be super accurate here. After some oil washing and streaking, it's finished, as are some of the other parts that make up this unit. Let's see them together. First the back of the engine with the fairing. Then the centre panel through which the stand fits. Then the main engine. Not bad. Now let's check out another painted subassembly. The antenna unit was painted in a similar way, but giving more strength to the concrete colour. I threw in a red and blue gas tank to the base unit as a matrix reference, just for fun. The centre of the dish is Weyerhaeusen green, and the arms are light reefer grey. Everything else is again given a wash with oils, until I'm happy with the result. Then we have the rest of the engine components. Dirty black and GN grey-green were the main colours used here, with the usual oil washes. The centre section was first painted with concrete, and then the other colours added by hand. The grey cowling is light reefer grey. The red markings were carefully masked and sprayed with boxcar red. Fitted together, this is quite an impressive unit, and only 6 parts. I know some manufacturers that couldn't make this out of less than 70. And finally, the lower hull itself. The base area was given a coat of matte black, and the sides were sprayed with light reefer grey. Some of the detail panels at the front were masked and sprayed with concrete. I then sprayed streaks of 1975 Lark light grey up the sides, radiating out from the centre. Concrete streaks were also added to give variety before finally weathering with oils. The wing mount was painted at the same time as the wings, using the same process. Now I have everything painted, let's see it all together at last. And here it is, all of the lower hull is now painted and assembled, albeit just dry for now. It'll be stripped again so I can prep and paint the upper hull, which will be the next episode. Not the final one in the series though, there's still more to come. Right now I'm really happy with how Slave 1 is looking. I may tweak some of the tones and weathering when the upper hull is finished, just to balance things up, but let's wait and see. The only thing I can see that might be slightly off is how dark the green is. It's so hard to tell from the photos, but I'm happy that it's in the spirit of Boba Fett and closer to his colours. If you think I'm out with the colours, please leave a message in the comments. The upper hull should be a lot quicker to paint, as I have a clear guide for that, but how long it'll take to prepare, I can't say. Right now, I'm just enjoying where I'm at. I hope you like it too. If you do, hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to see my Slave 1 finished in all her glory. I hope you've been enjoying Project Slave 1. If you have, please share with your friends and make sure you subscribe to my channel. So you catch my next video when it goes live, click on the bell icon. As you can see from my channel, I have lots of other projects, like my mouse tank, Bluebird, TAT and Stug, which I hope you'll find interesting. To learn about some of the techniques I use, check out my how-to series to find out more about moulding, casting, CAD design and 3D printing. If you have any questions about Project Slave 1, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.